But that's not what most police work is. So we have this whole set of mythology about police and policing and what they do. Let me give you just a couple of bits of that mythology. Every statement I'm about to make, I'm going to make 3 statements. Well, I'll make 2 statements. Neither one is true. Innocent people don't confess to the police. Actually, the evidence is innocent people confess all the time. The best evidence is eyewitness testimony. Actually, it's the worst evidence. It's about the worst evidence there is. I've had the experience, and I've shared it with my students occasionally, of watching a film in which you know you're going to be asked who did what and what happened and what were they wearing. Of course, in real life, we don't know that there's a crime about to happen, and they're going to ask us all these different things. So we're not even paying attention. But when you know, there's just a lot going on out on the street, in the mall, wherever it is. It's hard to keep track of it all. It's hard to get it straight. People get confused. Part of the myth here is that police are crime fighters, and to a very large extent they're not. They're really not. There are a lot of myths about police, but this is the most outstanding one. Police spend very little of their time either trying to prevent or investigate crime. Most police work is tedious and unglamorous, even when it involves dealing with crime. The average violent crime gets a total of 4 hours of police work. Heck, every crime that CSI or CSI New York investigates gets a lot more than that. But in the real world, the average violent crime gets 4 hours of police work, most of it filling out reports. So often the goal, and the police of course support this, is what we need to do is hire more police. We could do that. The standard measure we use is police officers per 1,000 of population. Nationally, we have about 2.3 police officers per 1,000 of population. But it varies dramatically in different parts of the country and different cities. And hiring more police officers doesn't tell us how they're going to be used, or that they're going to be used effectively, or even that they're going to be put out on the street, or what. Some cities have twice the ratio of others. Washington, D.C. has 4 times as many police officers per person as San Diego does. San Diego is safer in terms of the amount of crime. The research has not found any strong correlation, any reliable correlation between the number of police and crime. The 1994 Federal COPS program, Community-Oriented Policing Services, the federal government spent over $7 billion to allow local governments to hire and train more police. I don't quote Ronald Reagan often, but it was Ronald Reagan who said, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and eventually it adds up to real money. After what happened to the economy in 2008, I started to think that nobody cared about billions anymore. Now, if it wasn't $1 trillion, nobody was interested. So they spent a lot of money. The study found that these large increases in police presence reduced crime in large cities and increased it in small ones. Increased? Is that likely? No, not really. Probably what happened is a lot of people just don't bother reporting crimes. It's such a pain in the neck. I had people break into my car once in Washington, D.C. I called the police. They said, okay, wait by the car. 2 hours later, I called them again. They said, wait by the car. 2 hours later, I called them again. They said, well, if you really want, come in, here's the, because we just don't care. What we're going to do is fill out a form so you can file an insurance claim. That's what we're going to do. And in practice, I don't know that they could have done much else, but it wasn't a high priority for them. I understand that. More police made it easier to report crime, so people started reporting more crime. The cost of crime reduction by this program makes it clear that this is not an economic proposition. If you want to reduce crime with more police, you're going to spend a lot of money for relatively small reductions in crime. What we want is more police presence. We want police patrols. Actually, we have very good data on that because we performed experiments. Police patrols make no difference in crime. If police patrol twice as much, there's no less crime. If police patrol 3 times as much, there's no less crime. If police stop patrolling routinely entirely, there's no more crime. We feel better if there's more police patrols. It doesn't affect crime at all. If the police announced, we're going to stop routine patrols, we'd all yell and scream at them. But it would be a much better use of the resources. Arrests. The one thing I want to say about arrests is arrests are the weakest part of the criminal justice system, and they're the part that relies the most on discretion. You see that discretion every day. I've had conversations with my students, because I'm a criminal too, and I have been stopped by the police for driving too fast, including about 4 or 5 years ago here in the village of Manlius. And I was trying to get to my bridge game. Yeah, like that's an excuse. Yeah, officer, I'm trying to get to my bridge game. And I haven't been given a ticket any of these times. And my students, especially who are younger and male, and especially minority, get tickets all the time for doing exactly what I did, even if they say exactly what I said. Police have tremendous discretion in these matters. In practice, arrests are closely correlated with the class and race of the suspect.
Absolutely.
Closely correlated. Oh, we'll come back to that. Got a lot of data on that. So, what can police do to reduce crime? And the answer is not very much. Are there ways to reduce crime? Absolutely, but not so much with the police. They're not very good at stopping crime. They're not very good at solving crime. And it's not because they're not trying hard. It's in the nature of crime. Just in the nature of crime and police work. Police work is not the place to prevent crime for the most part. And solving crime is very difficult. We can talk during questions and answers if you want about how crimes get solved. You'll be surprised, or maybe you won't be, but most of them don't get solved the way they do on CSI. The court system. Whole set of myths here as well. The key one is the myth of equal justice. But every aspect of the judicial system favors those of us with the money. Every aspect of it. It starts with hiring attorneys. If you have to go with the public defender, good luck. Public defenders are hardworking, dedicated, competent people who typically are handling 4 times the caseload that they could seriously manage and have almost no resources to do it. There is a clear, other things being equal, people who hire their own attorneys and don't use a public defender are much more likely to get off. Much more likely. And then there's bail. I mean, bail is specifically designed so that rich people can get out and poor people can't. Specifically designed for that purpose. If you can't get bail and you stay in jail, if you had a job, you lose it. People who are unemployed are much more likely to be convicted and sentenced. If you don't have the assets for bail, you need to go to a bail bond agent who charges you a considerable amount, maybe 10% of the total, it depends on the circumstance, which you probably can't stay. If you stay in jail, other things being equal, if you stay in jail awaiting trial, you're much more likely to be convicted, much more likely to be sentenced. Other things being equal than if you're out. Conviction. When are you likely to be convicted? When are you likely to be sentenced? Maybe you won't. I consider these data shocking, but it's just one piece of data. When an African American shoots a European American, 1% of those cases are found to be justifiable. No crime, no conviction. When a European American shoots an African American, 9.5% of the cases are found to be justifiable. In the 20 states with stand your ground laws, and that's in my notes in quotations, stand your ground laws, 17% of the time a European American shoots an African American, it's found to be justifiable, not a crime. There are clear race and class issues in all of this. Sentencing. It is clear that sentencing is heavily dependent on issues related to class and race. The best chance in a state that has the death penalty, the best chance for you to get the death penalty is to be a poor African American male who kills a rich or middle class European American. The data are very clear on that, very clear. The death penalty is probably the most race and class related part of the criminal justice system. The population of people who are sentenced to death is very different from the general population or even the criminal population. Very different. It's on average poorer, on average less intelligent, on average more subject to mental illness, and on average much blacker. The correction system. Boy, isn't that a wonderful term? The correction system. I don't know who devised that. Actually, I used to know who devised that term. It wasn't George Orwell, but it probably should have been. We are the only democracy that locks up the percentage of its citizens. And anything close, nobody else comes close to us. We are the world leader. In fact, non-democracies don't lock up people at the same rate that we do. From the 1920s until 1975, the imprisonment rate hovered at about 110 per 100,000. That was the long-term trend. Since then, it's gone from 110 per 100,000 to 743 per 100,000. 20 to 25% are nonviolent drug offenders. This is 5 to 12 times the rate of other advanced industrial nations with lower crime rates than we have.
It's a business.
We can come back to that. In many ways, corrections is a business and is becoming more of a business as it's being subcontracted to private companies. Exactly. Absolutely, it's a business. I've run across somebody recently who had the exact experience that I teach. Someone who's really recently been placed, who's been incarcerated, wanted to make a phone call to his family. They're not allowed to have cell phones. I understand that. I understand why. We give a particular phone company a monopoly and then let them charge what they want, and 25, 35, 45% goes to local government. He's basically being charged $1 a minute. In this day and age, when most of us pay, I don't know, $30, $40, $50 a month and get all the free calls we want, he's being charged $1 a minute. In Britain, and again, our number is 743. In Britain, it's 153 per 100,000. In Germany, 89 per 100,000. In Japan, 63 per 100,000. And here's a statistic that relates to a number that many of you probably have heard. 30% of African American men now spend some time in prison. 60% of African American men who don't graduate from high school now spend some time in prison in their lives. It's actually become part of the normal life course for them. 75% of those incarcerated for drug crimes are African American, and we'll come back and talk about that in just a couple of minutes. And now, it's a business. So someplace, Santa Ana, California, now lets prisoners upgrade. You can upgrade. For $82 a night, you can get a cleaner and quieter cell. It sounds like the Holiday Inn. Other places are trying this as a moneymaker. So the poorest people even get the worst treatment in jail. There's no equality there anymore. The most important thing for you to remember about the correction system is that almost everybody gets out. Almost everybody gets out at some point. 700,000 people leave jail or prison every year. And we have made it harder and harder and harder for them to live their lives when they get out. Not easier, harder. We've made the system harsher. There's almost no relevant occupational training in prison. We basically eliminated almost all the college and prison programs by making the inmates ineligible for Pell Grants. Because people have said that, they lost their right for that. Why should they get Pell Grants? Which, about half of Lemoyne students get Pell Grants. Why should they get Pell Grants? They forfeited that. About that topic and others, I have some advice for you, which you can take or not take. Don't think about what these people deserve. Think about what's good for the rest of us. They're going to get out. How do you want them to live their lives when they get out? How do you want them to live their lives? I know how I want them to live their lives. I want them to get a job, support themselves, find a decent place to live. If they have children, take care of their children. That's what I want. They can't do that if it's impossible. They can't do it if they have no training. They can't do it if they can't find a job. Only a small fraction of those in prison who want or need drug rehab get it, or psychological counseling. Offenders on probation or parole are required to make substantial monetary payments that they can rarely afford. Many of them stop going to see their probation or parole officers because they can't afford the weekly fee. We limit the jobs that those who are released can take. We limit where they can live, and we generally make it difficult for them to earn a living. As well, in most states, we deny them the right to vote. Yes. Sometimes for life. Very often for life. We're the only country that does that. We tell them, we literally tell them, you're not fit to be one of us anymore. Don't be surprised if they're not loyal to us once we've conveyed that message. Under these circumstances, 1/3 of those who are released are rearrested within 3 years, and half of them are reconvicted. The harsher the treatment, the higher the recidivism rate. The longer the sentence and the harsher the incarceration we put them in, the more likely they are to reoffend. Which should tell you something about the whole notion of deterrence. And in many states, there's a growing tendency for the poor to end up incarcerated for minor offenses. In a growing number of jurisdictions, courts are responsible for raising money for themselves and the police. So they impose more and more fines. So somebody who's poor gets a speeding ticket that they can't pay. So they don't show up in court. And now they're hauled in and the fine is dramatically increased. And if they don't pay it now they're in contempt. And now we put them in jail, which, by the way, ends up not saving us any money at all. It cost, every one of those people we put in jail, it would be cheaper to waive 100 fines for 100 people because, in many places, it's more expensive to send them to jail than it is to send them to Harvard. And I sometimes tell my students, at least in jail, they might have a better class of companions, but the local courts in the city of New Orleans now have to raise 40% of their own revenue from fines. They're required to by law. So what happens if they don't find enough people to fine? They always find enough people to fine. They manage. Anyway. Let me come back and say a little bit about the criminal justice system and race, because our criminal justice system is heavily class and race biased. The data compiled by the so-called Sentencing Project show that African Americans are treated more harshly at every stage of the system. Arrest, indictment, conviction, sentencing, every stage they're treated more harshly. African Americans are 13% of the population. They're approximately 14% of drug users. That is, they use drugs in about the same proportion as whites do, but they're 37% of drug arrests. President Obama actually said this not that long ago, that the difference between young white kids and young black kids is they both smoke marijuana, but the young black kids go to jail, and the white kids don't. Notice he said it. If you go back and look at the stuff he said in his first term, he said no such thing. It's all in the second term when he never has to run for office again. Criminals and their families are not a constituency that politicians look for. You know, it's hard to run by being quote unquote soft on crime. There's one senator who made an attempt to work on prison reform. He did it in his last term when he announced he wasn't going to run anymore. Young African American males are actually less likely than young white males to use drugs. They don't have the money.
That's right.
They don't have the money to a large extent. But as we indicated earlier, and as I think we all know, a huge number of young African American men are in the criminal justice system. They're under arrest, in jail, on probation, on parole. Drug-related crime is a major reason. Why do we find drugs in their neighborhoods? That is actually an easy question to answer. We find drugs in their neighborhoods because that's where we look. If we looked on college campuses, we'd find it there. But we don't. Okay? If we looked in rich neighborhoods, we'd find it there. But we don't. That's not where we look. One illustration of this is how we traditionally have treated it. This is just starting to change now. Everybody here know what crack is?
Yeah.
Okay. Everybody know what cocaine is? Basically the same thing. I explain crack to my students as, think of the difference between fresh vegetables and frozen vegetables. Crack is cooked cocaine, it's easier to handle, and therefore, like frozen vegetables, which are cheaper than fresh, because they don't have to be handled as carefully, crack is cheaper. Crack is a minority neighborhood street drug. Cocaine is a designer drug for the middle class and the rich. But it's the same thing. It has exactly the same pharmacological properties. But the difference is that up until quite recently, and it hasn't completely changed, the penalties for crack sale and possession were over 10 times as severe as those for cocaine sale and possession. It's the same thing. The difference is in who uses it, who sells it, and who uses it. Are there things we could do to make the to make the system work better, to reduce crime? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. There are things we can do. Are there things that the police could do? Yeah, there are some. Maybe I shouldn't say this about my college, but what the heck. A couple of years ago, the president of the college told me that he'd had some conversations with the mayor of Syracuse. And we were going to put on a conference about crime. We wanted to put on a conference about crime. And they got he got a bunch of us together in the room. And I remember saying to him, Fred, I don't actually give a damn about putting on a conference on crime. But if you'd like us to help the city work on crime, if you'd like us to help the city reduce crime, that I'm happy to do. We have access to data, the ability to analyze data in a way that could be very helpful to the police. If the police function were more data-driven, we'd be better off. And we met with the police and the mayor's office, et cetera, and I said that, and then they turned over the whole project to somebody who wanted to hold a conference. So that we held a conference, but we didn't do anything about crime. I didn't go to the conference. I don't care, you know? But if you want our help to do something about it, we'll try to do something about it. Police working with other government agencies to reduce public nuisances such as slumlords can make a difference. approaches where police work with other public agencies to address poverty, unemployment, homelessness, education and drug abuse, all of them together. You need to do all of them together. Those have shown great promise. Those make a difference. They're not all successful. They're not all run well, but they make a difference. And actually we have data that show that $1 spent on some of those programs is more effective than $3 spent on additional policing. Courts. If we could allow more nonviolent offenders to remain out awaiting trial so they can keep their jobs and support their families, we would all be better off. Every time we talk, bail has increased dramatically in the past 50 years. Many times what's happened to the price index. We require bail of more people and we charge them more for it. We set bail higher. The bail bond industry has been pushing for that. In some cities, nonprofit groups have said, we want to pay the bail for these people. The bail bond industry has tried to prevent it. I understand why, but I don't have to like it. So anything we can do to reduce bail and reduce the pernicious influence of the bail bond industry would help. Greater use of mediation instead of criminal sanctions. Some areas are experimenting with this. Sometimes mediation between victims and offenders and restitution can be very successful. Not always, but sometimes. Greater funding for public defenders and more funding. Some of you have heard of the Innocence Project. If you want to see the basic book, it's called Actual Innocence. That should be in quotation marks because it's meant to be ironic. You can't appeal your verdict just because you're actually innocent. Just because they got it wrong. More funding for those kinds of things so that public defenders and assigned attorneys have some resources to devote to their clients. The correction system. The focus of the correction system needs to be on the notion that almost everyone gets out. The focus of our correction system is almost all on custodial issues. Making sure they don't escape, making sure that they don't damage the prison. The focus of the Norwegian correction system is all on the fact that they get out. Everybody, guards, etc., receives sociological and social work training so they can help inmates prepare for their lives after incarceration. We need counseling, we need drug treatment, we need occupational training, we need education. Those things are all expensive, but they're actually cheaper than crime. If we did them, in the end, we'd save money, we'd save resources, and we'd all be a lot less frightened. We need a re-entry system that helps offenders find housing and jobs, not the one that drops them off at the corner with $75 in their pocket and says, go forth and sin no more. Are there other things we could do? Yeah, there are. I suggested one. When something horrible happens, let's sympathize with the victims, but not immediately pass a law. Let's think about the laws we want to pass before we pass them. This should all be driven by the data, by the information. In particular, there are certain kinds of crimes. If we focused more on drug rehabilitation instead of drug crime, we would probably be better off instead of on punishment. And, 10, 15, 5 years ago even, I was saying to my students, the politics of that is not a winner. I don't see it happening. It's starting to happen. It is starting to happen. I think that's a good thing. And on that note, I am happy to stay here with you and lead some discussion, answer questions. Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me. One thing you didn't address that disturbs me greatly is the willingness of police and district attorneys to withhold evidence that the person is really innocent, but they want to, quote, solve the crime. So they're willing to see somebody go to jail for 10, 20, 30 years and live in a a box that's the size of that corner. And
Now, of course, we all know that withholding such evidence, there are rules about discovery. Again, some of you may be attorneys. I'm not an attorney. The rules are fairly clear. Are there exceptions that do people skirt those rules? Of course they do. I have no doubt about that. But let me take an even clearer example. I can point you to cases where the evidence now clearly shows that the person convicted didn't do it. Whether they were convicted because evidence was withheld, and the work of the Innocence Project suggests that evidence is withheld, not most of the time, but on a disturbingly frequent basis. Or simply because we didn't know, we made a mistake. And in many or most of those cases, exactly what you were suggesting is the attitude of the prosecutors. We convicted somebody for this. We think they're guilty. We're not reopening the case willingly. We're not going to do any of this. We'll fight you if you try to do it. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what does that mean? I translate that as, we don't care what the evidence says. We've made up our minds. That's a problem. It's a serious problem. And in some ways, it's a political problem. We can throw those prosecutors out if we want to. The most important person, we often think of the key to the criminal justice system is the judge in charge of the trial. The most important person in the criminal justice system is the prosecuting attorney. They have tremendous discretion. Who do we prosecute? Who don't we prosecute? What crimes do we charge them with? Do we settle or don't we settle? Because in fact, 90% of criminal cases are resolved by a plea bargain. 90%. People have taught, we can talk about that if you want. People have talked about outlawing that. You can't outlaw it. In practice, you can't. There's no way to get around it. But it's a serious problem. Yes, sir.
Could you comment a little bit about the effect of mass media such as television on the incidents and type of crime that's committed?
repeat the question.
He asked me to comment about the impact of the mass media on the incidence and type of crime that's committed. You mean, I'm not sure what you're getting at. Do you mean that people get ideas for crimes from television?
Yeah, my little grandson runs around, he's got a little gun, bah, 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 and he's shooting everybody, and stuff like that. I don't know. Is that a factor or is it? I don't know.
You know, I think it's a factor, but honestly, how many of us ran around? I always had a six-shooter around, you know? I may be a criminal, but I haven't shot anybody or threatened to shoot anybody. Although I've had one or two bridge partners over the years where some of you will relate, where the temptation has been great. For a while, when you were calling to make a reservation on an airline, you were getting somebody in prison until some people seemed uncomfortable with the notion of telling a convicted felon when you were going to be out of town and where you live. Some people seemed uncomfortable with that. I think I can understand that. You know, most of us had parenting and schooling that taught us the difference between playing those games and real life. Now, of course, people, you know, we're all concerned about video games, which have a tremendous amount of violence, but television always had a tremendous amount of violence on it. Is it a factor? Yes, but I don't think it's the most important factor. Yes, ma'am.
Has petty and grand larceny gone up in recent years?
No, it has not. Larceny has not gone up in any way, shape, or form overall. Yes,
Where
ma'am.
the video games had an effect was with the Columbine shooters, and because they practice their sharp shooting skills with the video games, and then they had the magazines that made it impossible for them to kill quickly. I mean, there is that.
There is that.
Yeah.
Although I guess I would tell you that people who are that disturbed
Right.
always seem to find a way.
That's not the biggest factor.
Yeah. I would be happier if they couldn't get the kinds of weaponry the kinds of arsenals they had, but
Do you know actually the average price of keeping someone in jail? Where does it range?
the most expensive state is California. California costs over $50,000 a year.
Okay, and Columbia costs $62,000. Just the
Columbia.
university,
Yes.
undergrad.
Yeah.
I mean, and Lemoyne is probably more
Let's
ingrained with
listen.
keeping a prisoner in jail.
Yes.
I mean, and we're paying for that.
We're paying for that. Yes, we're paying. Look, up until quite recently, corrections has been one of the most dramatically growing industries. Communities vie for these facilities because they provide jobs, and they provide economic development. And very often we've put them out in the sticks when most of the offenders who are convicted are from large cities, and this makes it almost impossible for them to maintain contacts with their families, and makes it much harder, makes re-entry even harder. But it's a business.
Well, Jamesville Penitentiary, there
Right.
used to be a farm right across the street, and the prisoners worked the farm and provided the food for them to eat. Now that's all subcontracted out.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, what is the most commonly used sources for your statistics? Are they Department of Justice, FBI? How do you?
The statistics I was quoting for you mostly come from the FBI Uniform Crime Reports. That's the largest source of data we have. There's some weaknesses in it. The FBI's Uniform Crime Reports basically rely on reports from local police and sheriff's departments to report crime to them. I would tell you that any particular number is not terribly reliable, but the trends are pretty reliable. There are other things. There's the National Crime Victimization Survey, which has some advantages. If you want to see what's happening in terms of levels of things, you really want to look at a variety of different sources.
Would you say that there is an inherent problem with the police officers reporting crimes that demonstrate their own ability or inability to do their job?
There might be. There's some conflict of interest sometimes. Although, once reporting it to the FBI is not the big deal. It's what happens earlier in that particular process. There are some issues with that. Absolutely, ma'am.
What is the reaction of your young male students to this information? Do they care? Do they think it's a lark? Do they?
So a lot of them care. A few of them decide that they don't believe me. Some of them decide maybe I don't want to be a police officer. Maybe it doesn't sound all that exciting or interesting. Some of them are fascinated. One wrote a letter, an anonymous letter to the president and the provost and the dean last year complaining about me, which is what I told them to do. I said, you can't get me fired filling out the course evaluations. Nobody sees those but me. You want to get me fired, you got to let the president and the provost know. One of them took me up on that. Probably would have helped if he wasn't so anonymous. Some of his complaints indicated he wasn't listening very clearly. For example, he said that I said, conservatives say a lot of things about crime that are crap. Did I say that? Yes. The following sentence was, liberals say a lot of things about crime that are crap. Somehow he didn't hear that part. He says I called George Washington a terrorist. I probably did. To the British, he was a terrorist.
That's right.
He was leading a revolt against legally constituted authority. It's what we call terrorism now. And even worse, damn Americans, they hid behind trees instead of coming out in the open and shooting and waiting to be shot like honorable people. I'm trying to make a point that, the point I'm trying to make with them is that crime is a social construct. Crime is what we decide crime is. Crime is what we make it. And we can change it. We have changed it over time. It used to be punishable. Some of you might like this. It used to be punishable in colonial Massachusetts to be a rebellious son. Some of you might like it. Some of you might not like it if you remember your childhoods, because most of us were guilty. Crime is a social construct in that sense. He also said that his uncle was a bail bond agent, and he resented what I said about bail bond agents. I understand that. I'll stand by that. Of all the people in this system whose influence is malign, bail bond agents are among them. Yes.
city of Rochester, I don't know what their crime stats are.
Worse than Syracuse.
Worse?
Rochester's worse than Syracuse.
I thought it was interesting, the piece I saw this week on the NewsHour about Xerox Corporation and their efforts to diversify as far as their personnel, and that the person who was the chief executive last time was a woman, and this time it's another woman, a black woman. And they're really working hard to bring diversity to their industry.
Let me suggest this to you. I've told you that crime rates are going down. Am I forecasting that will continue? Not necessarily. I don't have a crystal ball. Am I worried that it won't continue? I am, because it's not unrelated to some statistics that we all know, which is that the income distribution is getting less and less equal. Poverty and crime go together. They go together. And the less equal the income, let me put it in a more simple way. You don't want people in the society who don't have hope. You don't want people who think they can't support their families, who think that life can't be better for them, who think that things can't be better. To the extent that that population grows, you've got a population of people who have no stake in the society and no reason to follow the rules.
You'll have an American ISIS.
Maybe. I mean, we've some of the worst terrorist events here have been domestic and been about domestic issues.
Well, let me ask a question.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
either one of you.
Why do people who are innocent confess to crimes?
Why do people who are innocent confess to crimes? We could spend a lot of time on that, but let me give you a simple example. Very often they confess because they're kept in a room without sleep, with little or no food, exhausted, and told if they sign the statement, they can go home. They can go home and see their kids, they can go home and see their spouse, and they're told that they can't go home unless they do. By the way, this is the only developed country in which police are allowed to lie to suspects to get their cooperation. In no other country are police allowed to say, your friend ratted you out, when they didn't. In no other country are police allowed to say, we found your fingerprints there, when they didn't. Nowhere else. And if you study criminology in Britain, you'll find that they use the US as a series of case studies about what doesn't work and about what not to do. The goal is not to close cases. The goal is to close cases by identifying the actual offenders. That should be the goal.
Okay, I'm gonna,
Go ahead.
Don't read anything about me in this question.
Oh, too late. Too late.
It's
about a
all
friend.
these things that are horrendous. We say, oh, we do this, we do that, it's terrible. And meanwhile, the crime rate's going down. You know there are people who will say that those horrendous things that you don't like is what's causing the crime rate to go down.
I know there are people who will say that, but I've got
I didn't say that, though.
No. I've got studies. Really, the primary reason that the crime rates have gone down are demographic and economic. And it is, so again, we have data. What happens to comparable people who are punished more severely or less severely? What happens to somebody who gets probation, somebody who gets incarceration, somebody who gets a longer sentence, somebody who gets put in a supermax facility? And we know, the data show very clearly, other things being equal, the more harshly we treat you, the more likely you are to come out and reoffend. Okay? So I understand. I'm actually rather disappointed that my students don't notice that the way you have. That, Cliff, you say more and more people are incarcerated, you say crime has gone down. Does it mean it's working? I mean, that would be an obvious correlation to draw. And a further illustration of what statisticians always say, correlation is not causality.
Right, well, I was just gonna ask that for that same reason, because those who are given the harshest, longest sentence, what type of crimes are they being sent for? What is their mental status? Are they serial killers, so they may have some reason besides the long sentence.
Sure they may have, but we try to find cases. There's a study, for example, that compares people who are literally at the line between supermax and non-supermax facilities, who've committed very similar crimes, Some of them get put in supermax, some of them don't. If they're sentenced to similar amounts of time, the people sentenced to supermax facilities, which are the harshest federal facilities we have, are significantly more likely to reoffend than otherwise seemingly comparable people who are put in a still incarcerated, but put in a somewhat less harsh environment.
Was there not an effect of the labor unions early on in the prison system keeping work away from prisoners?
Yes. Yeah,
Right.
there've been issues about that, sure.
You know, the statement has always been they make our license plates and they get paid, you know, pennies to do that. I don't even know if they do that anymore.
I don't
But
know.
there is not really work in the prison system.
For a while, when you called your travel agent, when you called some of the airlines, they had subcontracted some of that work to prisons.
To prison.
You know, now we all think, you know, you've called the helpline and you're getting Rajesh, but it's actually we call him Randy, and he's actually. For a while, when you were calling to make a reservation on an airline, you were getting somebody in prison until some people seemed uncomfortable with the notion of telling a convicted felon when you were going to be out of town and where you live. Some people seemed uncomfortable with that. I think I can understand it.